Just a week or two before, a sozzled second engineer had explained to Carcassy that there had never been any gleeful society aboard the Vengeful Spirit, nor on any other line ship in his experience. Just quiet after-shift drinking and sullen gambling schools. The Remembrancers had brought their bohemian habits to the warship, and the crewmen and soldiery had been drawn to its light. The iterators and some senior ship officers had clucked disapprovingly at the growing casual conviviality, but the mingling was permitted. When Comnenus had voiced his objections to the unlicensed carousing the Vengeful Spirit was now host to, someone, and Carcassy suspected the commander himself, had reminded him that the purpose of the Remembrancers was to meet and fraternize. Soldiers and Navy adepts flocked to the retreat, hoping to find some poor poet or chronicler who would record their thoughts and experiences for posterity. Though mostly they came to get a skinful, play cards, and meet girls. It was, in Carcassy's opinion, the finest achievement of the Remembrancer program to date, to remind the expedition warriors they were human, and to offer them some fun, and to win rudely from them at cards. The game was Taj Main, and they were playing with a pack of square-cut cards that Carcassy had once lent to Mercedes Ollerton. There were two other Remembrancers at the table, along with a junior deck officer, a sergeant-at-arms, and a gunnery oberst. They were using, as bidding tokens, scurfs of gilt that someone had cheerfully scraped off one of the stateroom's golden columns. Carcassy had to admit that the Remembrancers had abused their facilities terribly. Not only had the columns been half-stripped to the ironwork, the murals had been written on and painted over. Verses had been inscribed in patches of sky between the shoulders of ancient heroes, and those ancient heroes found themselves facing eternity wearing comical beards and eye patches. In places, walls and ceilings had been whitewashed, or lined with gum paper, and entire tracts of new composition inscribed upon them. "I'll sit this hand out," Carcassy announced, and pushed back his chair, scooping up the meagre handful of scraped gilt flecks he still owned. "I'll find us all some drinks." The other players murmured approval as the sergeant-at-arms dealt the next hand. The junior deck officer, his head sunk low and his eyes hooded, thumped the heels of his hands together in mock applause, his elbows on the tabletop, his hands fixed high above his lolling head. Carcassy moved off through the crowd to find Zinkman. Zinkman, a sculptor, had drink, an apparently bottomless reserve of it, though where he sourced it from was anyone's guess. Someone had suggested Zinkman had a private arrangement with a crewman in climate control who distilled the stuff. Zinkman owed Carcassy at least one bottle, from an unfinished game of Merci Merci 2 nights earlier. He asked for Zinkman at 2 or 3 tables, and also made inquiries with various groups standing about the place. The viol music had stopped for the moment, and some around were clapping as Carnegie, the composer, clambered up onto a table. Carnegie owned a half-decent baritone voice, and most nights he could be prevailed upon to sing popular opera or take requests. Carcassy had one. A squall of laughter burst from nearby, where a small, lively group had gathered on stools and recliners to hear a Remembrancer give a reading from his latest work. In one of the wall booths, formed by the once golden colonnade, Carcassy saw Amory Seshlos carefully inscribing her latest remembrance in red ink over a wall she'd washed white with stolen hull paint. She'd masked out an image of the Emperor triumphant at Cyclonus. Someone would complain about that. Parts of the Emperor, beloved by all, poked out from around the corners of her white splash. "Zinkman! Anyone? Zinkman?" he asked. "I think he's over there," one of the Remembrancers watching Seshlos suggested. Carcassy turned and stood on tiptoe to peer across the press. The retreat was crowded tonight. A figure had just walked in through the chamber's main entrance. Carcassy frowned. He didn't need to be on tiptoe to spot this newcomer. Robed and hooded, the figure towered over the rest of the crowd, by far and away the tallest person in the busy room. Not a human's build at all. The general noise level did not drop, but it was clear the newcomer was attracting attention. People were whispering and casting sly looks in his direction. Carcassy edged his way through the crowd, the only person in the chamber bold enough to approach the visitor. The hooded figure was standing just inside the entrance arch, scanning the crowd in search of someone. "Captain?" Carcassy asked, coming forwards and peering up under the cowl. "Captain Loken?" Carcassy. Loken seemed very uncomfortable. "Were you looking for me, sir? I didn't think we were due to meet until tomorrow." "I was I was looking for Keela. Is she here?
Here? Oh, no, she doesn't come here. Please, Captain, come with me. You don't want to be in here.
Don't I?
I can read the discomfort in your manner, and when we meet, you never step inside the archway. Come on.
They went back out through the arched entranceway into the cool, gloomy quiet of the corridor outside. A few people passed them by, heading into the retreat.
It must be important, Carcassy said, for you to set foot in there.
It is, Loken replied. He kept the hood of his robe up, and his manner remained stiff and guarded. I need to find Keela.
She doesn't much frequent the common spaces. She's probably in her quarters.
Where's that?
You could have asked the watch officer for her billet reference.
I'm asking you, Ignace.
That important and that private, Carcassy remarked.
Loken made no reply. Carcassy shrugged.
Come with me and I'll show you.
Carcassy led the captain down into the warren of the residential deck, where the remembrances were billeted. The echoing metal companionways were cold, the walls brushed steel and marked with patches of damp. This area had once been a billet for army officers, but, like the retreat, it had ceased to feel anything like the interior of a military vessel. Music echoed from some chambers, often through half-open hatches. The sound of hysterical laughter came from one room, and from another the din of a man and a woman having a ferocious quarrel. Paper notices had been pasted to the walls, slogans and verses and essays on the nature of man and war. Murals had also been daubed in places, some of them magnificent, some of them crude. There was litter on the deck, an odd shoe, an empty bottle, scraps of paper.
Here,
said Carcassy. The shutter of Keela's billet was closed.
Would you like me to? Carcassy asked, gesturing to the door.
Yes. Carcassy rapped his fist against the shutter and listened. After a moment, he rapped again, harder.
Euphrates? Euphrates, are you there?
The shutter slid open, and the scent of body warmth spilled out into the cool corridor. Carcassy was face to face with a lean young man, naked but for a pair of half-buttoned army fatigue pants. The man was sinewy and tough, hard-bodied and hard-faced. He had numerical tattoos on his upper arms and metal tags on a chain around his neck. What? He snapped at Carcassy.
I want to see Euphrates.
Piss off, the soldier replied. She doesn't want to see you. Carcassy backed away a step. The soldier was physically intimidating. Cool down, said Loken, looming behind Carcassy and lowering his hood. He stared down at the soldier. Cool down, and I won't ask your name and unit. The soldier looked up at Loken with wide eyes. She's not here, he said. Loken pushed past him. The soldier tried to block him, but Loken caught his right wrist in one hand and turned it neatly so that the man suddenly found himself contorted in a disabling lock. Don't do that again, Loken advised, and released his hold, adding a tiny shove that dropped the soldier onto his hands and knees. The room was quite small and very cluttered. Discarded clothes and rumpled bedding littered the floor space, and the shelves and low table were covered with bottles and unwashed plates. Keela stood on the far side of the room, beside the unmade cot. She had pulled a sheet around her slim, naked body and stared at Loken with disdain. She looked weary, unhealthy. Her hair was tangled, and there were dark shadows under her eyes.
It's all right, Leaf, she told the soldier. I'll see you later.
Still wary, the soldier pulled on his vest and boots, snatched up his jacket, and left, casting one last murderous look at Loken.
He's a good man, Keela said. He cares for me.
Army?
Yes. It's called fraternization. Does Ignace have to be here for this?
Carcassy was hovering in the doorway. Loken turned. Thank you for your help, he said. I'll see you tomorrow. Carcassy nodded.
All right, he said.
Reluctantly, he walked away. Loken closed the shutter. He looked back at Keela. She was pouring clear liquor from a flask into a shot glass.
Can I interest you? She asked,
gesturing with the flask.
In the spirit of hospitality?
He shook his head.
I suppose you Astartes don't drink. Another biological flaw ironed out of you?
We drink well enough, under certain circumstances.
And this isn't one, I suppose.
Keela put the flask down and took up her glass. She walked back to the cot, holding the sheet around her with one hand and sipping from the glass held in the other. Holding her drink out steady, she settled herself down on the cot, drawing her legs up and folding the sheet modestly over herself.
"I can imagine why you're here, Captain," she said. "I'm just amazed. I expected you weeks ago."
I apologize. I only found the second file tonight. I obviously hadn't looked carefully enough.
"What do you think of my work?"
Astonishing. I'm flattered by the pics you shot on the embarkation deck. I meant to send you a note, thanking you for copying them to me. Again, I apologize. The second file, however, is
"Problematic?"
she suggested. At the very least, he said.
"Why don't you sit down?" she asked.
Loken shrugged off his robe and sat carefully on a metal stool beside the cluttered table. I wasn't aware any pics existed of that incident, Loken said.
"I didn't know I'd shot them,"
Keeler replied, taking another sip.
"I'd forgotten, I think. When the first captain asked me at the time, I said no, I hadn't taken anything. I found them later. I was surprised."
Why did you send them to me? He asked.
She shrugged. "I don't really know. You have to understand, sir, that I was traumatized. For a while I was in a very bad way. The shock of it all. I was a mess, but I got through it. I'm content now, stable, centered. My friends helped me through it. Ignace, Sadie, some others. They were kind to me. They stopped me from hurting myself."
Hurting yourself? She fiddled with her glass, her eyes focused on the floor.
"Nightmares, Captain Logan. Terrible visions. When I was asleep and when I was awake. I found myself crying for no reason. I drank too much. I acquired a small pistol and spent long hours wondering if I had the strength to use it."
She looked up at him.
"It was in that pit of despair that I sent you those pics. It was a cry for help, I suppose. I don't know. I can't remember. Like I said, I'm past that now. I'm fine. I feel a little foolish for bothering you, especially as my efforts took so long to reach you. You wasted a visit."
I'm glad you feel better, Loken said. But I haven't wasted anything. We need to talk about those images. Who's seen them?
"No one. You and me, no one else."
Did you not think it wise to inform the first captain of their existence? Keeler shook her head.
No, not at all. Not back then. If I'd gone to the authorities, they'd have confiscated them, destroyed them probably, and told me the same story about a wild beast. The first captain was very certain it was a wild beast, some Xenos creature, and he was very certain I should keep my mouth shut, for the sake of morale. The Picts were a lifeline for me back then. They proved I wasn't going mad. That's why I sent them to you."
Am I not part of the authorities? She laughed.
"You were there, Logan. You were there. You saw it. I took a chance. I thought you might respond and..."
And what?
"Tell me the truth of it."
Logan hesitated.
"Oh, don't worry," she admonished, rising to refill her glass. "I don't want to know the truth now. A wild beast, a wild beast. I've got over it. This late in the day, Captain, I don't expect you to break loyalty and tell me something you're sworn not to tell. It was a foolish notion, which I now regret. My turn to apologize to you." She looked over at him, tugging up the edge of the sheet to cover her bosom. "I've deleted my copies. All of them. You have my word. The only ones that exist are the ones I sent to you."
Loken took out the data slate and placed it on the table. He had to push dirty crockery aside to make a space for it. Keeler looked at the slate for a long while, and then knocked back her glass and refilled it.
"Imagine that," she said,
her hand trembling as it lifted the flask.
"I'm terrified even to have them back in the room."
I don't think you're as over it as you like to pretend, Loken said.
"Really?"
she sneered. She put down her glass and ran the fingers of her free hand through her short blonde hair.
"Hell with it, then, since you're here. Hell with it."
She walked over and snatched up the slate.
"Wild beast, eh? Wild beast."
Some form of vicious predator, indigenous to the mountain region that...
"Forgive me, that's so much shit," she said.
She snapped the slate into the reader slot of a compact edit engine on the far side of the room. Some of her pictures and spare lenses littered the bench beside it. The engine whirred into life, and the screen lit up, cold and white. "What did you make of the discrepancies?" "Discrepancies?" Loken asked. "Yes." She expertly tapped commands into the engine's controls and selected the file. With a stab of her index finger, she opened the first image. It bloomed on the screen. "Terror, I can't look at it," she said, turning away. "Switch it off, Keeler." "No. You look at it. Look at the visual distortion there. Surely you noticed that. It's like it's there, and yet not there. Like it's phasing in and out of reality." "A signal error. The conditions and the poor light foxed your pictor's sensors, and—" "I know how to use a pictor, Captain. And I know how to recognize poor exposure, lens flare, and digital malformance. That's not it. Look." She punched up the second pict and half looked at it, gesturing with her hand. "Look at the background. And the droplets of blood in the foreground there. Perfect pict capture. But the thing itself. I've never seen anything create that effect on a high-gain instrument. That wild beast is out of sync with the physical continuity around it, which is, Captain, exactly as I saw it. You've studied these closely, no doubt." "No," said Loken. Keeler pulled up another image. She stared at it fully this time, and then looked away. "There, you see? The after image. It's on all of them, but this is the clearest." "I don't see." "I'll boost the contrast and lose a little of the motion blurring." She fiddled with the engine's controls. "There. See now?" Loken stared. What had at first seemed to be a frothy, milky ghost blurring across the image of the nightmare thing had resolved clearly, thanks to her manipulation. Superimposed on the fuzzy abomination was a semi-human shape, echoing the pose and posture of the creature. Though it was faint, there was no mistaking the shrieking face and racked body of Xavier Jubal. "Know him?" she asked. "I don't, but I recognize the physiognomy and build of an Astartes when I see it. Why would my pictor register that, unless—" Loken didn't reply. Keeler switched the screen off, popped out the slate and tossed it back to Loken. He caught it neatly. She went back over to the cot and flopped down. "That's what I wanted you to explain to me," she said. "That's why I sent you the picts. When I was in my deepest, darkest pits of madness, that's what I was hoping you'd come and explain to me. But don't worry. I'm past that now. I'm fine. A wild beast. That's all it was. A wild beast." Loken gazed at the slate in his hand. He could barely imagine what Keeler had been through. It had been bad enough for the rest of them, but he and Nero and Cinderman had all enjoyed the benefit of proper closure. They'd been told the truth. Keeler hadn't. She was smart and bright and clever, and she'd seen the holes in the story, the awful inconsistencies that proved there had been more to the event than the first captain's explanation. And she'd managed with that knowledge, coped with it, alone. "What do you think it was?" he asked. "Something awful that we should never know about," she replied. "Throne, Loken. Please don't take pity on me now. Please don't decide to tell me." "I won't," he said. "I can't. It was a wild beast. Euphrates, how did you deal with it?" "What do you mean?" "You say you're fine now. How are you fine?" "My friends helped me through. I told you." Loken got up, picked up the flask, and went over to the cot. He sat down on the end of the mattress and refilled the glass she held out. "Thank you," she said. "I found strength. I found—" For a moment, Loken was certain she had been about to say faith. "What?" "Trust. Trust in the Imperium. In the Emperor. In you." "In me?"
"Not you personally. In the Astartes. In the Imperial Army. In every branch of mankind's warrior force that is dedicated to the protection of us mere mortals." She took a sip and sniggered. "The Emperor, you see, protects."
"Of course he does," said Loken.
No, you misunderstand," said Keeler, folding her arms around her raised, sheet-covered knees. "He actually does. He protects mankind through the legions, through the martial court, through the war machines of the Mechanicum. He understands the dangers, the inconsistencies. He uses you and all the instruments like you to protect us from harm, to protect our physical bodies from murder and damage, to protect our minds from madness, to protect our souls. This is what I now understand. This is what this trauma has taught me, and I am thankful for it. There are insane dangers in the cosmos, dangers that mankind is fundamentally unable to comprehend, let alone survive. So, he protects us. There are truths out there that would drive us mad by one fleeting glimpse of them. So, he chooses not to share them with us. That's why he made you.
That's a glorious concept, Loken admitted.
In the Whisperheads that day, you saved me, didn't you? You shot that thing apart. Now you save me again, by keeping the truth to yourself. Does it hurt?
Does what hurt?
The truth you keep hidden.
Sometimes, he said.
Remember, Garviel, the Emperor is our truth and our light. If we trust in him, he will protect.
Where did you get that from? Loken asked.
A friend. Garviel, I have only one concern. A lingering thing that will not quit my mind. You Astartes are loyal, through and through. You keep to your own and never break confidence.
And?
Tonight, I really believe you would have told me something, but for the loyalty you keep with your brothers. I admire that, but answer me this. How far does your loyalty go? Whatever it was happened to us in the Whisperheads, I believe an Astartes brother was part of it. But you close ranks. What has to happen before you forsake your loyalty to the Legion and recognize your loyalty to the rest of us?
I don't know what you mean, he said.
Yes, you do. If a brother turns on his brothers again, will you cover that up too? How many have to turn before you act? One? A squad? A company? How long will you keep your secrets? What will it take for you to cast aside the fraternal bonds of the Legion and cry out, "This is wrong"?
You're suggesting an impossible...
No, I'm not. You of all people know I'm not. If it can happen to one, it can happen to others. You're all so drilled and perfect and identical. You march to the same beat and do whatever is asked of you. Loken, do you know of any Astartes who would break step? Would you? Would you? If you saw the rot, a hint of corruption, would you step out of your regimented life and stand against it? For the greater good of mankind, I mean.
It's not going to happen, Loken said. That would never happen. You're suggesting civil disunity, civil war. That is against every fibre of the Imperium as the Emperor has created it. With Horus as War Master, as our guiding light, such a possibility is beyond countenance. The Imperium is firm and strong, and of one purpose. There are inconsistencies, Euphrates, just like there are wars and plagues and famines. They hurt us, but they do not kill us. We rise above them and move onwards.
It rather depends, she remarked, where those inconsistencies occur.
Loken's vox cuff suddenly began to bleat. Loken raised his wrist and thumbed the call stud. I'm on my way, he said. He looked back at her. Let's talk again, Euphrates, he said. She nodded. He leant forwards and kissed her on the forehead. Be well. Be better. Look to your friends.
Are you my friend? She asked.
Know it,
he said. He got up and retrieved his robe from the floor. Garviel, she called from the cot.
Yes.
Delete those images, please. For me. They don't need to exist. He nodded, opened the shutter, and stepped out into the chill of the hall. Once the shutter had closed, Keela got up off the cot and let the sheet fall from her. Naked, she padded over to a cupboard, knelt and opened its doors. From inside she took out 2 candles and a small figurine of the Emperor. She placed them on the top of the cupboard and lit the candles with an igniter. Then,
She rummaged in the cupboard and pulled out the dog-eared pamphlet that Leaf had given her. It was a cheap, crude thing, badly pressed from a mechanical bulk printer. There were ink soils along its edges, and rather a lot of spelling mistakes in the text. Keela didn't care. She opened the first page and, bowed before the makeshift shrine, she began to read. The Emperor of mankind is the light and the way, and all his actions are for the benefit of mankind, which is his people. The Emperor is God, and God is the Emperor. So it is taught in the Lectitio Divinitatis, and above all things, the Emperor will protect. Loken ran down the companionways of the Remembrance's billet wing, his cloak billowing out behind him. Sirens were sounding. Men and women peered out of doorways to look at him as he passed by. He raised his cuff to his mouth. "Nero, report. Is it Tarek? Has something happened?" The Vox crackled, and Vipers's voice issued tinnily from the cuff speaker. "Something's happened, all right, Garvey. Get back here." "What? What's happened?" "A ship, that's what. A battle barge has just translated in-system behind us. It's Sanguinius. Sanguinius himself has come." 7. Just a week or so earlier, during one of their regular private interviews, Loken had finally told Mercedy Ollerton about the great triumph after Ulanor. "You cannot imagine it," he said. "I can try." Loken smiled. The Mechanicum had planed smooth an entire continent as a stage for the event. Planed smooth? What? With industrial melters and geoformer engines. Mountains were erased and their matter used to infill valleys. The surface was left smooth and endless, a vast table of dry, polished rock chippings. It took months to accomplish. It ought to have taken centuries. You underestimate the industry of the Mechanicum. They sent 4 labor fleets to undertake the work. They made a stage worthy of an emperor, so broad it could know midnight at one end and midday at the other. "You exaggerate," she cried, with a delighted snort. "Maybe I do. Have you known me do that before?" Ollerton shook her head. "You have to understand, this was a singular event. It was a triumph to mark the turn of an era, and the Emperor, beloved of all, knew it. He knew it had to be remembered. It was the end of the Ulanor campaign, the end of the crusade. The coronation of the War Master. It was a chance for the Astartes to say farewell to the Emperor before his departure to Terra, after 2 centuries of personal leadership. We wept as he announced his retirement from the field. Can you picture that, Mercedy? 100,000 warriors weeping." She nodded. "I think it was a shame no remembrances were there to witness it. It was a moment that comes only once every epoch." "It was a private affair." She laughed again. 100,000 present, a continent levelled for the event, and it was a private affair. Loken looked at her. "Even now you don't understand us, do you? You still think on a very human scale." "I stand corrected," she replied. "I meant no offence," he said, noticing her expression. "But it was a private affair. A ceremony. 100,000 Astartes. 8 million army regulars. Legions of Titan war machines, like forests of steel. Armor units by the 100. Formations of tanks, thousands upon thousands. Warships filling the low orbit, eclipsed by the squadrons of aircraft flying over in unending echelons. Banners and standards. So many banners and standards." He fell silent for a moment, remembering. The Mechanicum had made a roadway. 1/2 a kilometre wide and 500 kilometres long. A straight line across the stage they had levelled. On each side of this road, every 5 metres, was an iron post topped with the skull of a greenskin. Trophies of the Ulanor War. Beyond the roadway, to either hand, promethium fires burned in rock-creek basins. For 500 kilometres. The heat was intense. We marched along the roadway in review, passing below the dais on which the Emperor stood, beneath a steel-scaled canopy. The dais was the only raised structure the Mechanicum had left, the root of an old mountain. We marched in review, and then assembled on the wide plain below the dais. Who marched? All of us. 14 legions were represented, either in total or by a company. The others were engaged in wars too remote to allow them to attend. The Lunar Wolves were there en masse, of course. 9 Primarchs were there, Mercedy. 9. Horus, Dawn, Angron, Fulgrim, Lorgar, Mortarion, Sanguinius, Magnus, the Khan. The rest had sent ambassadors. Such a spectacle. You cannot imagine.
I'm still trying.
Loken shook his head. I'm still trying to believe I was there.
What were they like?
You think I met them? I was just another brother warrior marching in the file. In my life, lady, I have seen almost all of the Primarchs at one time or another, but mostly from a distance. I've personally spoken to 2 of them. Until my election to the Mournival, I didn't move in such elevated circles. I know the Primarchs as distant figures. At the Triumph, I could barely believe so many were present.
But still, you had impressions.
Indelible impressions. Each one so mighty, so huge, and so proud. They seemed to embody human characteristics. Angron, red and angry. Dawn, solid and implacable. Magnus, veiled in mystery. And Sanguinius, of course, so perfect, so charismatic.
I've heard this of him.
Then you've heard the truth. His long black hair was pressed down by the weight of the shawl of gold chain he wore across his head. The edges of it framed his solemn features. He had marked his cheeks with grey ash in mourning. An attendant stood by with inkpot and brush to paint the ritual tears of grief on his cheeks. But Primarch Sanguinius shook his head, making the chain shawl clink. I have real tears, he said. He turned not to his brother Horus, but to Torgadon. Show me, Tarik, he said. Torgadon nodded. The wind moaned around the still figures assembled on the lonely hillside, and rain pattered off their armor plate. Torgadon gestured, and Tarvitz, Bull, and Lucius stepped forwards, holding out the dirty relics. These men, my lord, Torgadon said, his voice unusually shaky, these children of the Emperor recovered these remains selflessly, and it is fit they offer them to you themselves. You did this honor, Sanguinius asked Tarvitz. I did, my lord. Sanguinius took the battered Astartes helm from Tarvitz's hands and studied it. He towered over the captain, his golden plate badged with rubies and bright jewels, and marked, like the armor of the War Master, with the unblinking eye of terror. Sanguinius's vast wings, like the pinions of a giant eagle, were furled against his back, and hung with silver bands and loops of pearls. Sanguinius turned the helm over in his hands, and regarded the armorer's mark inside the rim. 8-Night Leopard, he said. At his side, Chapter Master Ralderon began to inspect the manifest. Don't trouble yourself, Ral, Sanguinius told him. I know the mark. Captain Thoros, he will be missed. Sanguinius handed the helm to Ralderon and nodded to Tarvitz. Thank you for this kindness, Captain, he said. He looked across at Eidolon. And to you, sir, my gratitude that you came to Frome's help so urgently. Eidolon bowed and seemed to ignore the dark glare the War Master was casting in his direction. Sanguinius turned to Torgadon. And to you, Tarik, most of all, for breaking this nightmare open. I do only what my War Master instructs me, Torgadon replied. Sanguinius looked over at Horus. Is that right? Tarik had some latitude. Horus smiled. He stepped forwards and embraced Sanguinius to his breast. No 2 Primarchs were as close as the War Master and the Angel. They had barely been out of each other's company since Sanguinius's arrival. The majestic Lord of the Blood Angels, the 9th Legion Astartes, stepped back and looked out across the forlorn landscape. Around the base of the ragged hill, hundreds of armored figures waited in silence. The vast majority wore either the hard white of the lunar wolves or the arterial red of the angels, save for the remnants of the detachment of Emperor's children, a small knot of purple and gold. Behind the Astartes, the war machines waited in the rain, silent and black, ringing the gathering like spectral mourners. Beyond them, the hosts of the Imperial army stood in observance, banners flapping sluggishly in the cold breeze. Their armored vehicles and troop carriers were drawn up in echelon, and many of the soldiers had clambered up to stand on the hulls to get a better view of the proceedings. Torgadon's spear tip had raised a large sector of the landscape, demolishing stone trees wherever they could be found, and thus taming the formidable weather in this part of Murder. The sky had faded to a mottled powder grey, run through with thin white bars of cloud, and rain fell softly and persistently, reducing visibility in the distances to a foggy blur. At the War Master's command, the main force of the assembled Imperial ships had made planetfall in the comparative safety of the storm-free zone.
"In the old philosophies of terror," Sanguinius said, "so I have read, vengeance was seen as a weak motive and a flaw of the spirit. It is hard for me to feel so noble today. I would cleanse this rock in the memory of my lost brothers and their kin who died trying to save them."
The angel looked at his Primarch brother.
"But that is not necessary. Vengeance is not necessary. There is Xenos here, implacable alien menace that rejects any civilized intercourse with mankind, and has greeted us with murder and murder alone. That suffices. As the Emperor, beloved by all, has taught us, since the start of our crusade, what is anathema to mankind must be dealt with directly to ensure the continued survival of the Imperium. Will you stand with me?"
"We will murder together," Horus replied. Once those words were spoken, the Astartes went to war for 6 months. Supported by the army and the devices of the Mechanicum, they assaulted the bleak, shivering latitudes of the world called Murder, and laid waste the Megarachnid. It was a glorious war, in many ways, and not an easy one. No matter how many of them were slaughtered, the Megarachnid did not cower or turn in retreat. It seemed as if they had no will, nor any spirit to be broken. They came on, issuing forth from cracks and crevices in the ruddy land, day after day, set for further dispute. At times, it felt as if there was an endless reserve of them, as if unimaginably vast nests of them infested the mantle of the planet, or as if ceaseless subterranean factories manufactured more and yet more of them every day to replace the losses delivered by the Imperial forces. For their own part, no matter how many of them they slaughtered, the warriors of the Imperium did not come to underestimate the Megarachnid. They were lethal and tough, and so numerous as to put a man out of countenance.
"The 50th beast I killed,"
little Horus remarked at one stage,
"was as hard to overcome as the first."
Loken, like many of the lunar wolves present, personally rejoiced in the circumstances of the conflict, for it was the first time since his election as War Master that the commander had led them on the field. Early on, in the command habitant, one rainy evening, the Mournival had gently tried to dissuade Horus from field operations. Abaddon had attempted, deftly, to portray the War Master's role and importance as a thing of a much higher consequence than martial engagement.
"Am I not fit for it?"
Horus had scowled, the rain drumming on the canopy overhead.
"I mean you are too precious for it, Lord," Abaddon had countered. "This is one world, one field of war. The Emperor has charged you with the concerns of all worlds and all fields. Your scope is—"
"Ezekiel."
The War Master's tone had betrayed a warning note, and he had switched to Chthonic, a clear sign his mind was on war and nothing else.
"Do not presume to instruct me on my duties."
"Lord, I would not," Abaddon exclaimed immediately, with a respectful bow.
"Precious is the word,"
Aximan had put in quickly, coming to Abaddon's aid.
"If you were to be wounded, to fall even, it would—"
Horus rose, glaring.
"Now you deride my abilities as a warrior, little one. Have you grown soft since my ascendance?" "No, my lord, no."
Only Torgadon, it seemed, had noticed the glimmer of amusement behind the War Master's pantomime of anger.
"We're only afraid you won't leave any glory for us," he said.
Horus began to laugh. Realizing he had been playing with them, the members of the Mournival began to laugh too. Horus cuffed Abaddon across the shoulder and pinched Aximan's cheek.
"We'll war this together, my sons," he said. "That is how I was made. If I had suspected back at Ulanor that the rank of War Master would require me to relinquish the glories of the field forever, I would not have accepted it. Someone else could have taken the honor. Gilliman, or the lion, perhaps. They ache for it, after all.
More loud amusement followed. The laughter of Chthonians is dark and hard, but the laughter of lunar wolves is a harder thing altogether. Afterwards, Loken wondered if the War Master had not been using his sly political skills yet again. He had avoided the central issue entirely, and deflected their concerns with good humour and an appeal to their code as warriors. It was his way of telling them that, for all their good counsel, there were some matters on which his mind would not be swayed. Loken was sure that Sanguinius was the reason. Horus could not bring himself to stand by and watch his dearest brother go to war. Horus could not resist the temptation of fighting shoulder to shoulder with Sanguinius, as they had done in the old days. Horus would not let himself be outshone, even by the one he loved most dearly. To see them together on the battlefield was a heart-stopping thing. Two gods of war, raging at the head of a tide of red and white. Dozens of times they accomplished victories in partnership on murder that should, had what followed been any different, become deeds as lauded and immortal as Ullanor or any other great triumph. Indeed, the war as a whole produced many extraordinary feats that posterity ought to have celebrated, especially now the remembrances were amongst them. Like all her kind, Mercedy Ollerton was not permitted to descend to the surface with the fighting echelons, but she absorbed every detail transmitted back from the surface, the daily ebb and flow of the brutal warfare, the losses and the gains. When, periodically, Loken returned with his company to the flagship to rest, repair, and rearm, she quizzed him furiously, and made him describe all he had seen. Horus and Sanguinius side by side was what interested her the most, but she was captivated by all his accounts. Many battles had been vast, pitched affairs, where thousands of Astartes led tens of thousands of army troopers against endless files of the megarachnid. Loken struggled to find the language to describe it, and sometimes felt himself foolishly borrowing lurid turns of phrase he had picked up from the chronicles of Ursh. He told her of the great things he had witnessed, the particular moments. How Luke Cedere had led his company against a formation of megarachnid 25 deep and 100 across, and splintered it in under half an hour. How Sacrus Carminus, captain of the Blood Angels, 3rd Company, had held the line against a buzzing host of winged clades through one long, hideous afternoon. How Yacton Cruz, despite his stubborn, tiresome ways, had broken the back of a surprise megarachnid assault and proved there was metal in him still. How Tybalt Mar, the Either, had taken the low mountains in 2 days and elevated himself at last into the ranks of the exceptional. How the megarachnid had revealed more and yet more nightmarish biological variations, including massive clades that strode forwards like armoured war machines, and how the titans of the Mechanicum, led at the van by the Deus Irae of the Legio Mortis, smote them apart and trampled their blackened wing cases underfoot. How Saul Tarvitz, fighting at Torgadon's side rather than in the cohort of his arrogant Lord Eidolon, renewed the Lunar Wolves' respect for the Emperor's children through several feats of arms. Tarvitz and Torgadon had achieved a brotherhood during the war and eased the discontent between the two legions. Loken had heard rumours that Eidolon was initially displeased with Tarvitz's deportment, until he recognized how simple brotherhood and effort was redeeming his mistake. Eidolon, though he would never admit it, realized full well he was out of favor with the War Master, but, as time passed, he found he was at least tolerated within the bounds of the commander's war tent, and consulted along with the other officers. Sanguinius had also smoothed the way. He knew his brother Horus was keen to rebuke Fulgrim for the high-handed qualities his Astartes had lately displayed. Horus and Fulgrim were close, almost as close as Sanguinius and the War Master. It dismayed the Lord of Angels to see a potential rift in the making. "You cannot afford dissent," Sanguinius had said. "As War Master, you must have the undivided respect of the Primarchs, just as the Emperor had. Moreover, you and Fulgrim are too long bound as brothers for you to fall to bickering." The conversation had taken place during a brief hiatus in the fighting, during the 6th week, when Ralderon and Cedere were leading the main force west into a series of valleys and narrow defiles along the foothills of a great bank of mountains. The two Primarchs had rested for a day in a command camp some leagues behind the advance. Loken remembered it well. He and the others of the Mournival had been present in the main war tent when Sanguinius brought the matter up. I don't bicker, Horus said, as his armourers removed his heavy, mud-flecked war gear and bathed his limbs. The Emperor's children have always been proud, but that pride is becoming insolence. Brother or not, Fulgrim must know his place. I have trouble enough with Angron's bloody rages and Perturabo's damned petulance. I'll not brook disrespect from such a close ally. Was it Fulgrim's error, or his man Eidolon's? Sanguinius asked. Fulgrim made Eidolon Lord Commander. He favours his merits, and evidently trusts him, and approves of his manner. If Eidolon embodies the character of the Third Legion, then I have issue with it. Not just here. I need to know I can rely upon the Emperor's children. And why do you think you can't? Horus paused while an attendant washed his face, then spat sidelong into a bowl held ready by another. Because they're too damn proud of themselves. Are not all Astartes proud of their own cohort? Sanguinius took a sip of wine. He looked over at the Mourneville. Are you not proud, Ezekiel? To the ends of creation, my lord, Abaddon replied. If I may, sir, said Tukadden, there is a difference. There is a man's natural pride and loyalty to his own legion. That may be a boastful pride and the source of rivalry between Astartes, but the Emperor's children seem particularly haughty, as if above the likes of us. Not all of them, I hasten to add. Listening, Loken knew Torgadden was referring to Tarvitz and the other friends he had made among Tarvitz's unit. Sanguinius nodded. It is their mindset. It has always been so. They seek perfection, to be the best they can, to echo the perfection of the Emperor himself. It is not superiority. Fulgrim has explained this to me himself. And Fulgrim may believe so, Horus said. But superiority is how it manifests amongst some of his men. There was once mutual respect, but now they sneer and condescend. I fear it is my new rank that they resent. I'll not have it. They don't resent you, Sanguinius said. Maybe. But they resent the role my rank invests upon my legion. The lunar wolves have always been seen as rude barbarians. The flint of Chthoniya is in their hearts, and the smudge of its dirt upon their skins. The children regard the lunar wolves as peers only by dint of my legion's record in war. The wolves sport no finery or elegant manners. We are cheerfully raw, where they are regal. Then maybe it is time to consider doing what the Emperor suggested, Sanguinius said. Horus shook his head emphatically. I refused that on Ulanor, honor though it was. I'll not contemplate it again. Things change. You are War Master now. All the legions Astartes must recognize the preeminence of the 16th Legion. Perhaps some need to be reminded. Horus snorted. I don't see Rus trying to clean up his berserk horde and rebrand them to court respect. Leman Russ is not War Master, said Sanguinius. Your title changed, brother, at the Emperor's command, so that all the rest of us would be in no mistake as to the power you wield and the trust the Emperor placed in you. Perhaps the same thing must happen to your legion. Later, as they trudged west through the drizzle, following the plodding Titans across red mudflats and skeins of surface water, Loken asked Abaddon what the Lord of Angels had meant. At Ulanor, the first captain answered, the beloved Emperor advised our commander to rename the 16th Legion, so there might be no mistake as to the power of our authority. What name did he wish us to take? Loken asked. The Sons of Horus, Abaddon replied. The 6th month of the campaign was drawing to a close when the strangers arrived. Over the period of a few days, the vessels of the expedition, high in orbit, became aware of curious signals and etheric displacements that suggested the activity of starships nearby, and various attempts were made to locate the source. Advised of the situation, the War Master presumed that other reinforcements were on the verge of arrival, perhaps even additional units from the Emperor's children. Patrolling scout ships, sent out by Master Comnenus, and cruisers on picket control, could find no concrete trace of any vessels, but many reported spectral readings, like the precursor field elevations that announced an imminent translation. The expedition fleet left high anchor and took station on a battle-ready grid, with the vengeful spirit and the proud heart in the vanguard,
and the Misericord and the Red Tear, Sanguinius's flagship, on the trailing flank. When the strangers finally appeared, they came in rapidly and confidently, gunning in from a translation point to the system edges. 3 massive capital ships, of a build pattern and drive signature unknown to Imperial records. As they came closer, they began to broadcast what seemed to be challenge signals. The nature of these signals was remarkably similar to the repeat of the outstation beacons, untranslatable and, according to the War Master, akin to music. The ships were big. Visual relay showed them to be bright, sleek, and silver-white, shaped like royal scepters, with heavy prows, long, lean hulls, and splayed drive sections. The largest of them was twice the keel length of the Vengeful Spirit. General alert was sounded throughout the fleet, shields raised and weapons unshrouded. The War Master made immediate preparations to quit the surface and return to his flagship. Engagements with the Megarachnid were hastily broken off, and the ground forces recalled into a single host. Horus ordered Comnenus to make hail and hold fire unless fired upon. There seemed a high probability that these vessels belonged to the Megarachnid, come from other worlds in support of the nests on Murder. The ships did not respond directly to the hails, but continued to broadcast their own curious signals. They prowled in close and halted within firing distance of the expedition formation. Then they spoke. Not with one voice, but with a chorus of voices, uttering the same words, overlaid with more of the curious musical transmissions. The message was received cleanly by the Imperial Vox, and also by the astro-telepaths, conveyed with such force and authority, Ingmei Sing and her adepts winced. They spoke in the language of mankind. "Did you not see the warnings we left?" they said. "What have you done here?" Part 3. The Dreadful Sagittary. One.